So let's talk about the terms fiction and technology, and then some steps towards reclaiming these terms, which I believe could be actually useful for imagining a future. The first part is called turbulent waters. When I step out of bed, I live no longer, but through me lives Christ, the Christ of capitalism. I am fused and part-taking, as all that my body does in its awoken state is participate in the passage of power. I own myself not, but my body belongs to the world, everything flowing into each other, and yet I feel how the dams of reason try to separate the ebbs of the irrational, or that which is deemed and labeled such, dreams that sift into waking. To be part of such body of water, to be human, I try to find the borders, to delineate the edges. But the lake has no borders. There is an infinite system of veins that interface with the porous surroundings, the waters underneath, the air, the atmosphere. But still there is a strong heritage I wake up with. I stand up on firm ground, and with a scalpel knife I cut thin slices on my plate. With my tongue, language, I push the pieces against my palate, savoring tiny pieces of the world. I own this moment. I feel, to know, to touch the world. Turbulent waters, and the dam bursts. There is a loud minority of dominant world narration. And it is surrounded by a dominant. There is a loud minority of a dominant world narration, and it is surrounded by a non-dominant majority waiting. Sifting through whispered stories, bear with me while I recall a few of these tensions floating around. Why? As self-fulfilling prophecies, the future to come is dependent on the breadth of imagination of possible futures. The inclusion of a plurality of modes of world narration, each with their own conditions of felicity and usefulness, is a necessary condition of an optimal future that caters to diverse requirements in a world full of multi-level existences. According to Meyasu, we need more extra science fiction, stories that allow inaccessible segments of the world to concurrent and future in scientific investigation, and precisely to address ones waiting long in the shadows of the Enlightenment. Human, do not confuse what you say with what you actually do. Human pursue diverse goals, some of them deemed noble, but there is little so prevalent as the pursuit of power. One of the side threads I wish to weave in here is the narrative of current modes of governance, and to challenge the independence of modes of knowing from modes of governing, ways of conditioning joy and content and self-actualization. So this is the part I call the rivers of gold. A neoclassical and for brevity's sake dumbed-down narrative follows a discontent group of merchants, artisans and craftspeople who, in pursuit of freedom and progress, leave the Middle Ages, torches blazing, throwing out the theo-aristocracy and trading their wares at the marketplace. With the pursuit of freedom comes a pursuit of truth, and all dogmas are proven experimentally wrong. Newton constructs a map to the world. And yet the sun is placed inside the human mind, into the center. Newton constructs a map to the world. It allows more accurate world representations. The center of the world is not the earth, but the sun. And yet the sun is placed inside the human mind, into the center, from within to shine on all things measurable. Supply and demand in concert burn the planet and infinite resources with miracle machines of a mechanistic universe, infinite progress. it all trickles down, a democratic shower, a shared joy. I mean, what world are we talking about? Now, Marx talks about shadows. The surplus of production is reaped by the owners of the means of production, the capitalist. Thus, even as progress is maintained, the machines evolve, and wealth is distributed disproportionately. The owners, in order to maintain profit, exploit the labor class. So then politics is a counterbalance, a countercurrent. But them busters bomb the palaces to open floodgates of the wealthy and redistribution by political means to counter economic strongholds. All in order to lift off limiting caps of industrialization. The spirit of progress can soar free, burning more of the planet. Exploitation moved further down the rank to the lower orders, to disable the animals, the plants, the minerals, the meek. Now, Nitzen and Bickler propose a revelatory approach in the description of the inner workings of capital. They describe through evidence and data that neither the neoclassical utility nor the Marxian labor value described correctly the relationship between price and value. Price and value are distinct and are forced into marriage. Capital is a mode of power where certainty of future income is translated into a narrative of relative rank. Power is not about the currently owned, but the vision of future income. The ones who produce the most believable narrative of their future success are the owners of the world. Politics is neither just a disruptive force of the market nor a balancing organization. Politics and economies are not separate, but a joint venture of distributing futures, a narrative machine that enables power to those who wield it. What forces are available to counter the power, to deliver a dissolution of concentrated power? Power needs to be confronted as power. Predictability can be capitalized. A rational experimental science allows predictable futures. Dreams pouring from every track. Dominant narratives strengthen power. Non-predictable outcomes are harder to capitalize. Knowledge is generated from the measurable. And as soon as an artist is predictable enough, the market can bet against it, the investor can gain power. As Nitzen and Bickler remark about the University of Chicago, which was founded by Rockefeller, who called the university his best investment ever made, and we can see that the university remains a stronghold of academic forces behind the revival of neoclassicist economy that divorces politics from economy. It is important which words word worlds, as Donna Haraway puts it. Or we can bring up Tolkien or Bruno Latour, who talk about histories of worlds that arise from different world representations. Christ, the Son of God. There needs to be streams of stories that allow contestation of dominant power. The story of Christ, the Son of God. These voices need institutions, agents, and while all the same subjugated to the power of capitalization, its politics, its academics, its technology, power needs to be confronted vis-a-vis. A partial contestation is doomed to be that, only partial. As the conservative right questions the state and academia, and the classical left questions economic goals and technology, a fiction is generally not in contrast with reality. Reality is only the dominant mode of fiction, a dominance that is established with power. And thus I believe that fiction is the first term to be reclaimed. We need new fiction. The next part is called amniotic fluid. And in our quest of detangling dominant power and the power of fiction, let us conjure up a few cases. Case studies, they cannot be called, but perhaps thought experiments based around established experience. Let us look at moments where reality seems to be one thing, and yet behind the smokescreen of beliefs, sides, and honest endeavor, the thread of power can be discovered. A conspiracy? No, absolutely not. But an infrastructure which is a lot stronger the less visible it is. So the question of abortion and population control seems to be a question that is delineated between the scientific definition of birth, of consciousness, and religious instantly inherited humanity on the other hand. Every form of being is more than non-being. A life full of pain and torment is an experience incomparably richer to the non-existence, says the ultimate religious maxim. And it is hard to argue that there is indeed a mandate in existence. After Teilhard de Chardin, even in Catholicism there are examples of a continuous consciousness down to the lower orders, when he's talking about the evolution of consciousness through the whole of matter. The history of anti-abortion religious stance is thus indeed very old. But when looking at one part of the democratic legislature, when we see within the framing of politics, or eventually the cogs of power, one does have to suspect that the Christian views in conservative politics are only the useful thought ideology for nationwide population control. So just look at it. A family of 2 children, under normal working conditions, retains and perhaps adds to the inherited wealth from the previous generation. A single child of a family at the point of establishing its own family can join 2 heritages. Multiple single child generations can result in a generational wealth ascension, a class transgression. Something similar can be seen in China after the one-child policy. The middle class gained a lot more power. There is more movement up in the class hierarchy. On the other hand, if we look at a 3+ child family, especially for the lower classes, means a generational poverty and a crumbling of wealth, even at peak labor output, generally meaning that the class status is hardly retained and very hardly ascending. With a wealthier middle class since the 18th century, the ruling theo-aristocracy wished for methods of population control that could be easily circumvented by the aristocracy themselves, abortions, wedding laws, homosexuality, yet would keep the wealth of the population under relative control by banning these for the general public. These mechanisms of population control are the basis of some of today's conservative politics. The narrative is that values are extracted from the past and retained for the future. Yet it is power structures that allow the distribution of differential power to remain similar, retain a multiplying workforce that never gets wealthy enough to propose a threat to power vis-a-vis. If the narrative is helped out the tracks of power, even the value of life can be retained as a category. Except the new fiction, the new narrative, should now include a decoupling of value from price. Price remains a measure of politico-economic power. Value and power is unaccounted for. A decoupled fiction of value allows to protest power. Through self-deception, value-serving powers emerge. To self-deception, values serving power emerge. A Christian conservative politics that in the name of God lobbies for the status quo of distribution is under the disguise of meritocracy. What is the kind of narrative that allows the justification of meritocracy? As another thought experiment or case study, we must move to the language at the birth of large-scale capitalization, population control, and the language of science that is born at the same time. There is a shorthand for justifying races and competitions by referring to Darwin or Huxley or Dawkins, the selfish gene. Animals, cognitants, biologic machines, tiny thingies, even genes compete for resources and are rewarded with eternal life through generations and generations of multiplication to bring existence something other than me, rather than nothing. A great competition of survival. It almost seems that the aim of life, conscious or non-conscious, is eternal life through competition. It is revelatory to read in the introduction of The Origin of Species by Darwin about the order of society, Malthus, population growth, growth patterns, economic order, and how nature can be modeled after the workings of the market. Nature is great and complex. Nature is a great and complex marketplace where each individual is trading time and resources before death and for eternal life. The narrative of evolution is marked by the age and the language of dominant power. One only might theorize what kind of evolutionary theory would be available if it was modeled on the societies of certain Native Americans, hunter-gatherers, or groups that view agriculture as an exploitation. One may only dream of the kind of economic theories that could have been the inspiration for theories of frozen evolution or the punctuated equilibrium of Eldridge and Gould. Gould describes an evolution that is not gradual but happens in large jumps, succeeded by long eras of relative balance. The changes and competition happens only in crises, where a new model is to be found. The goal of such evolution can be thought of as an equilibrium. A competition is only the necessary means of getting to these equilibria. Other current evolutionary theories talk about the possibility of nature not selecting the best single trait, and thus genetics not being the only factor, but interdependent societies of creatures are evolving together. Total cooperation would be the aim of such evolution, and let us again think what kind of power narratives can be derived from that. It is natural to compete. All animals do that. Except perhaps what is natural is modeled after what is competition, in which case it is just an argument in a circle. Perturbance. Referring to the world via the reference model given to us through the natural sciences remains an extremely effective tool. Yet its connection to a single reality, which is one and undividable, is rather problematic. The reality wars in a niche and unimportant for power philosophical circles like Harman, Zizek, Brassier, Meillassoux, and the speculative turn were preceded by the science wars of Feyerabend and Polanyi, Stenger's law against Popper and then Sokals and their ilk. But all this big power confrontation about the dominant narrative of the world reference peaked already. At the beginning of the last century, the great Bergson and Einstein debate already addressed the possibility of relative irrelevance of philosophical referral. Einsteinian time is complex, unintuitive, but measurable. And from those debates it still echoes from walls of chambers of the Enlightenment. It has such a strong force over how we refer to reality. There is no real challenge against the effectiveness of referring to the world through the academic natural sciences. Yet this power is to be confronted with the cultural power mechanisms that allow its construction as a common reality. And when the question of engineering the planet comes up, we necessarily need to ask the question if the only face of Earth that we can possibly construct is the engineered one. So the Bill Gates Foundation is voting for capitalization. And the project of David Keith from Harvard is getting due attention and funding. But what if we hear other voices and make ourselves sensitive not only to dominant sounds of world referral, even with the help of researchers like Holly Jane Buck, and we can say, yes, surely, letting out freons, by David Keith, letting out freons into the atmosphere is a possibility, and sure, large-scale industrial carbon capture should be a thing. What other ways to incentivize big business? But political imagination should not stop there. If the industrial solutions are not enough, new power structures must be imagined. Differential power must be met with equilibristic power. Algae and AI all can have a different role. So now about the people of the ocean. It's the time to redeem the other word. Now it is the time to redeem the other word. What is technology? It is a tool, an industrial mechanism that lessens the workload. While in the service of power, the practical use of dominant world referral, the natural sciences might sound as an enabler of the future, we would propose to widen the scope. Parallel technologies must exist that help differentiate references to the world to function. The technologies of the sacred can overlap with technologies of love, geoengineering, or travel, or it all depends on the conditions of these fictions themselves. On the one hand, technologies of the dominant power enable certain visions of future, solar powers, solar panels, drought, water wars. We should not simply give up on these tools available and join technology of steam and petrol engine with technology of power distribution that undermine the dominance. This injects balance into the great competition and enables a possible balance and equilibrium that can be held at least until the next crisis. Interdependency should be named, analyzed, and included in referrals to the world. Technologies of the future should be an open platform of economies, of machines, of cognitants, possibilities that account for the loss that is apparent in every kind of world referral, that accounts for values passing through cracks. Solar punk, where technology is the way the story is being told. Technology is the inner structure of fictitious world. It is the end. In the end, the best story always wins. Power needs to be met with better stories. And this is the role of technology, to help tell better stories. We can use solar farms and AI to generate the cities of the future, but these technologies cannot remain a smokescreen for power capitalizing on future instability, betting against its own kind. Death must be present too. The distance to death cannot remain a bargaining space, and must be a value. The only future that is possible is the eternity that is already now. Indigenous protocols, the Maori initiative that talks about the way of reimagining and the training of AI through inclusion of protocols that have been used to relate to others and others, humans, animals, or things in the culture of the Maori. There need to be stories that reconcile the need to build astronomical observatories on Maori holy grounds. Earthly sciences have no primacy, but nor do romantic nationalistic shortcuts for primal worlds and rituals. We need stories that count these techniques for the same order. For a planetary, not just a global balance sheet, we need to assemble everybody. But how to capitalize the future with methods that include others in the balance sheet? Protocols of looking after, working with matter, irrespective of their visibility, distance, or relative consciousness, is what we need. In whatever form the Messiah might come, the entanglement of the world should find ways of talking about it. Waters above and waters below. We surely need technology for carbon capture. Yes, there needs to be power plants that drive the CO2 underground and guard them for centuries to come. At the same time, no narrative should be able to escape. Future speculating is just bargaining time. The end of all things, of systems, of societies, of technologies, of religions should be accounted for all the time. Power should be confronted, but we do not look into the direction of power, because behind there, in the shadows of the Enlightenment, somewhere there, hardly clearly beyond the gates of the city, in the cemetery, underground, there is death. Human carbon capture. Everything is flowing, bubbling waves, and in constant motion. In pandemic and extinction angst are only neck pain of the turned head, neck pain of the head turned away. Afraid of all water under and above ground, how do I join them? Those who have the courage to look into those googly eyes. For that, we need new fiction and all the technology that is available in the world. We need to tell that story.